Hey everybody, it's Doc here. This video is going to be the history of cartridges. So going from pretty much powder loosely packed into a bamboo tube as like some makeshift mortar, all the way down to the stuff that we're going to be seeing issued to US troops within the next 2 to 3 years. Let's kick this off, guys. Alright, so we're going to go with the Latak. So it's a term in the Philippines for a weapon system like this. So this is one of the first guns that you would see running around the world. So this was prominently beginning development in China, and it spread through most of Asia, and then it got grabbed by general traders and everything that were in Europe, the Mediterranean and such, and then this is where the larger advancements of firearms began. So essentially it was a bamboo tube that was just cut down from a stalk of bamboo, and the plant grows in sections. So if you see how those portions here tend to grow, that is how the bamboo grass grows. It grows in sections. So what they would do is they would take a stalk, their length of choice, it varies from whatever they wanted to do. They'd take a heated rod and ram it down to create essentially what would be the barrel, and then they would burn a smaller fuse into the bottom portion, which you would get your fuse port, and then they'd pack loose powder. If they were a smarter marksman, they would take a sack and then they would slide that down there, pack some rocks, chunks of metal, anything generally around them, and then they would take a stick, may have a match or something on it, and they would touch that touch hole, which would ignite the powder, and then obviously generate all that energy and gas that has to go somewhere, and it would go flying down the muzzle into their enemy of choice. All right. Then after a few centuries leading up to 1411, we found the Matchlock. All right, so the Matchlock decided to incorporate general mechanics and clockwork machinery, and this is where guns started to be a individual thing that could generally become standard issue. All right, so it essentially still has the general concept of a tube. You would ram your main powder charge and your ball and your wad down the muzzle of the weapon, located here. All right, and then the interesting part is they would have this serpentine, which would generally just be a large rod designed to hold a match. Pretty much just a tight and rolled strand soaked in oil or wax that would be lit, that would be slow burning, so you'd have a longer period of time. They'd attach that to the serpentine, and through clockwork that would be leading to a trigger or just a corresponding rod in the simplistic weapons designs, it would lower into the pan, and a pan would essentially be like a bowl that would have a smaller hole that would lead into the breech or chamber of the weapon. Simplistically, the bottom of the barrel, because essentially it was just a long tube sealed at one end with an open end. And then that hot match would go into the pan, burn a small portion of powder that would go through the touch hole, which would ignite the powder that would be behind the projectile. All right, now think about this. If you have a hot burning match somewhere, weather, so such as rain, mist, or humidity, would interfere or just completely distinguish the fire of your match. Also, combining a hot open flame around an individual who has containers of loose powder sporadically placed on them and on their hands, notorious for people just going up in flame. So obviously it was a useful weapon system. It's what allowed the Spanish to control most of southern Central America. It's what allowed most of the prominent nations of Europe and Asia to be where they are today because of this weapon system, because body armor was still in the concept of being strongly used on the battlefield, because we were still beating each other with large metal sticks. that they needed something hard hitting to pierce through those later stage body armor and just completely negate that and still have the ability to take your enemy out from a distance. So obviously a large ball sitting around an estimation of 45 to 50 caliber flying at someone with some sheet steel armor in front of them, it works. All right, and then after this, we found ourselves with a Wheellock. All right, so we figured out if you take a piece of pyrite and then you combine it with a rotating piece of metal, it generates a spark. So the idea behind the Wheellock that was introduced in 1517, it would be a clockwork assembly of a rotating metal wheel that would be rotated by a spanner or a wrench. It'd be rotated a quarter turn. That would generate enough energy to spin that rod that would ignite sparks coming off of the pyrite that would be coming from the cock of the weapon. Focus or big keys on that because we're going to see this in the next few action systems. All right, so that would rotate, generate sparks that would go into the powder of the pan, which would be very similar to the Matchlock. Now, the problem with the Matchlock, it would, since it was such a complicated system, it would be increasingly less cost effective for people to generally purchase this, which is why you always would see wheel-locked weapons to have lots of embellishing or fancy designs, because this would be something that noblemen or people that had the money to purchase these weapons. So obviously the common man would still be running around with a matchlock or just simply still use a bow. Well, shortly after, by shortly I mean a few hundred years, we managed to simplify the concept of the action with the Flintlock. Now, the Flintlock has a lot of strong similarities with the rearward portion of the action as the Wheellock. You would still have the general cock, but instead of a piece of pyrite, it would be a just sharpened piece of flint that would be counteracted by the prism of the weapon, which would just generally be a metallic plate. Now, to roll back to the problems that we had with the Matchlock, where moisture and water would completely obliterate your ability of having an ignition system for the powder, the flint and the prism would cover the pan, which would then help aid in the protection of it. It would still have problems with being wet because while you're out in the open and inside the elements when you're using your weapon, obviously water will get everywhere. Now, this was the go-to weapon system for many of years. So you'll commonly see a lot of individual tricks of the trade going into the Flintlock, but it's still the standard design of a piece of flint hitting a piece of steel, putting sparks into a pan that would be burning into a touch hole, which would thus generate that. Well, after a while, the idea of pouring loose powder into your pan, which is just another step of complications, which would where we would come across the percussion cap, which would be introduced in 1807. Now, the percussion cap is rather similar to most of us when we were kids, when we had that little cap gun with the little red plastic caps or the paper ones. Essentially a very similar concept. Now, that would go over a nipple, which would be located here, which would have a small hole which would go into the chamber to where the charge would be. Now, from there, it would have a small violent type of explosive, but very minute amounts. So the hammer, which would replace the idea of the stereotypical cock, which would become the hammer, which essentially still has a very similar use to the ones we drive nails in today. It would strike down hit the percussion cap, which would ignite that small bit of explosive, which would travel down that small little touch hole and would ignite that main powder charge. All right, now we're going to go into paper cartridges. My apologies, the image happened to have malfunctioned on me. But anyway, the paper cartridge is essentially consolidating the powder and your projectile and your wad into an individual system, to where it would be an easier way to logistically move the product, easier way for manufacturers to sell their product, easier ways to store it. That way you have individual sets of individual rounds instead of having loose powder, loose ball, loose patches, which would obviously, in the hesitation of trying to reload your weapon to get another round down range, a lot of steps for something simple, right? So we'd go with the paper cartridge, which earlier you would bite the end of it, pour a small bit of powder into your pan, and then load the rest of the mass of that paper cartridge down the muzzle, similar to just fresh loader, just a lot more simplistic, right? All right. Well, after a while, everyone got sick and tired of biting powder and going on and so forth. So then we decided to design the Pinfire cartridge. Now, we're getting into stuff that's starting to look a lot more similar today, to where we would have that brass jacket that holds your powder, your primer, and your projectile. Those 3 P's of ammo, right? So it began commonly with shotguns, and then it moved over to revolvers. Now, the idea of that is there was this small metallic pin that would hang off of the bottom head of the cartridge, which would then strike that small bit of explosive, similar to the kinds that were inside those percussion caps, which would then ignite the powder, build up that energy, and then thus propel the projectile down the barrel. Now, the difficulty with that is you have a large pin hanging off your weapon. That obviously is increased to damage, and the idea of it getting jostled or bumped into something hard, which would then ignite that round, or you dropping it right, bad media and bad PR, right? So then the Rimfire cartridge was designed. So now we're going into the stuff that we still use today. All right, you're still going to see Rimfire 22s and 32s and those small base cartridges in your common range today. I'm pretty sure most of us have a little clinking 22 somewhere in the house. All right, 1 second. Now, they take similar brass case design to the Pinfire, and they place it around the bottom rim of the cartridge. All right. Now, a firing pin, instead of utilizing a hammer, would then strike that small bit of primer that is sitting at the base of the cartridge, dent it, ignite it, thus igniting the powder, thus building up that energy to propel that round down the barrel. We bump into the idea of centerfire cartridges. So that way, a lot more narrower, a lot easier design in the breech, and further designs made it more applicable than having a rim around your cartridge. All right. Now, with this, they utilized that percussion cap idea and placed it inside the center of the cartridge. So then you would have a centrally hitting firing pin. Then from there, you would have the ability to ignite your powder and thus propelling that round down the barrel. Similar promise. Now, that is the common design of the cartridge of today. You have your brass case, you would have your desired projectile, and obviously you would have your primers and then your propellant. Or, my apologies, your propellant, then your primer. Well, now we're going to roll into the future of things and what's expected within the next 2 to 3 years of military ammunition design, which thus, commonly throughout history, if the military adopts it, the civilian market's going to want it, and then everyone's rolling with that design idea until someone else introduces another military-based design. So this is where the idea of the polymer-cased ammunition. All right? So, polymer-cased ammunition, instead of using that solid brass or steel container that would hold your powder and your primer and everything all in one, it is now polymer, which would allow you to keep lower heat inside your chamber, lower quantity of cook-off, and most importantly, lighter weight. We all know, get a fresh container of ammo and we have to move it somewhere, it's pretty heavy, right? Now picture having to carry 3 or 4 plus hundred of these for miles. That is what the Department of Defense, especially the Army and the Marine Corps, want to adopt. It allows you to carry more ammo, which this would allow those service members to be out there a lot longer with their standard issue quantity of ammo, and not to mention the increased benefits of the health and well-being of that weapon system. Hope you guys enjoy my lovely spiel. Hope you guys have a nice day, and I hope you learned something. Goodbye.
Welcome to Dan Doc's channel.